She'll send you a note if you, oh, it's freezing in here. Hello, everybody. Cream, is my lipstick okay? Thank you. Very important question. It's freezing, yeah. I should have worn stockings. Okay. Thank you so much, yeah. My printer died this morning, so of course I'd written some remarks and I couldn't print them out, but they did. They were nice enough to do it for me. Actually, I watched her movie again yesterday. Such a great movie. It is freezing. Oh,
My God.
keep us awake anyway.
Yeah.
Oof.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and I see we have a packed house for a very important event. It is freezing in here, so if you brought your parkas, you'll be advantaged. My apologies. Can't explain it. At any rate, many of our strong supporters are in the front row, along with an amazing artist. And I want to say first that I represented a place called Terrangeles, that is another name for Los Angeles, in Congress for almost 2 decades. Many of my constituents were members of the largest Iranian community outside Iran. And I understand that the very talented Shirin Neshat, whom today's event celebrates, spent some time in LA too. I'd also like to point out that she got her BA, MA, and MFA at UC Berkeley. That's in another part of the state of California. No doubt California played a formative role in her success, which I'm happy to see the Hirshhorn Museum recognize. At the Wilson Center, we know, and we say this often, that art and culture are among our most critical foreign policy tools. It may be, and it certainly is often the case, that our government is not popular in other parts of the world, but our culture almost always is. And it is one of our strongest exports, and it is something we should spend more time promoting. We hold exhibitions here on a regular basis, installations from Ukraine, China, Russia. We also had an installation inside the Wilson Center, sponsored by the Foundation for Art and Preservation in Embassies. One of our great exports in the U.S. is to put U.S. artists' art in U.S. embassies. And just last week, I was in the residence of our ambassador to France and saw an enormous amount of excellent American art hanging on the walls of that huge place in Paris. As a regular visitor to the Hirshhorn myself, I'm always impressed by its scholarship, relevance, and impact, principles which we value here as well. It was at the Hirshhorn, and I saw it twice, that the first North American survey of works by Ai Weiwei, China's most famous dissident artist, was displayed. How many of you went to that exhibit? How many of you thought it was fabulous? Well, Hirshhorn leadership sitting in the front row is loving this presentation. So, today's event builds on that tradition. It deepens a partnership between 2 very accomplished Smithsonian institutions. That would be the Hirshhorn and the Wilson Center. And I'd like to thank especially Haleh Esfandiari, director of the Wilson Center's Middle East program, for making this collaboration happen. Introducing our program is Dr. Melissa Chu, who started last September as director of the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. She came to that post from the Asia Society Museum, where she had served as director since 2004. Her experience in contemporary Asian and Asian American art runs deep, and so Shirin Neshat, Facing History, is this is Melissa Chu's inaugural exhibition as director. Please join me in welcoming her now.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about the Shirin Neshat Facing History exhibition, which opens today at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. It's true that I have only been 6 months in the job, but I'm delighted to be able to spend today talking about not just Shirin's work, but also beyond, because I think it's such a topical subject that her work deals with, and we have an esteemed panel of speakers today to address it. The Hirshhorn, when I first joined 6 months ago, was celebrating its 40th anniversary, and we continue to celebrate our 40th anniversary. When we were founded, we had this idea of focusing on the 20th and 21st century, so modern and contemporary art. And we have one of the best collections of European and American contemporary art in this country and even internationally, with some great examples, which you can see on our newly renovated third floor galleries today when you visit. We have had a great slate of public programs, including an incisive talk by the esteemed artist Klaus Oldenburg as part of our 40th anniversary celebrations, and we'll continue to do those kinds of programs above and beyond our exhibition with Shirin Neshat. I wanted to acknowledge Melissa Ho, my co-curator in the exhibition. Melissa, I'm going to ask you to stand just to embarrass you. But this was completely a great collaboration between myself, Melissa, and Shirin to make this exhibition happen. The exhibition's a little bit different from previous shows of Shirin's work. And that's why our collaboration with the Woodrow Wilson Center here is so appropriate. That, in fact, when you go to see the exhibition, you'll see that it's mapped out in terms of connecting to Iranian history. And the reason why we did that, rather than showing Shirin's work as they were produced in the usual kind of chronological fashion, was that really underpinning nearly all of Shirin's work is her connection to Iran. That, of course, she speaks to greater universal issues that we can all understand and connect to. But there is this specificity that I'm really looking forward to hearing more about from our panelists. I wanted to, of course, recognize the Honourable Jane Harman. Thank you for that lovely introduction. We need to get you over at the Hirshhorn more often because you've converted all of these people over to seeing art and culture at our place. I wanted to also, of course, thank Haleh for her great leadership in making this collaboration happen. And Elizabeth Dugal, our deputy director, who I think initiated the first conversations with Haleh to really push this forward. And of course, our panelists, Karim Sajapour, Barbara Slavin, and Roya Hakakian, because we're going to hear some great things today, and I look forward to it. So I'm going to turn over now to Haleh to introduce the program, and I hope that you'll all come visit the Hirshhorn exhibition to see more, a kind of an actual expanded view of the conversation that we'll hear today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, for your support. Thank you, Melissa, and special thanks to our two teams, your team at the Hirshhorn and the team at the Wilson Center, who worked very closely together to make this event possible. It's, of course, an honor to welcome Shirin Neshat, an extraordinary artist, to the Wilson Center. We are delighted to be part of the 3 days festivities marking the opening of the exhibition Shirin Neshat Facing History. I think it's a very rare occasion when you have an artist spending 3 days at the opening of an exhibit. So I think the Hirshhorn is very privileged, so are we at this end. When you face history, you also face her story. Shirin's work, as you will hear today and as you will see at the exhibition at the Hirshhorn, deals with the story of women during an important period of contemporary Iranian history. Some of these events Shirin observed up close, others she observed from a distance. But always, as you will see in the exhibit, women play a prominent part in her work. We have invited 3 authors who are experts on Iran to discuss the issue of gender and politics in Shirin's work. Karim Sajjadpour from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council and the former public policy scholar at the Wilson Center, and Roya Hakkakian, currently a fellow at the Wilson Center. We have distributed their bios and I've asked each of my speakers not to speak more than 5 minutes and to leave time for the discussion and also some questions from both this audience and also the overflow. We have an overflow, and as it is our customary, we take questions in writing from the overflow. We don't neglect anybody. But we also have a special treat for you. Shirin has graciously accepted to speak for a few minutes in the closing part of our session. So with that, I will open the floor. Karim, you go first.
Great. Thank you, Halajan. Thank you all for coming. It's really such an honor to be here. I'd like to congratulate Melissa and Shirin on such a wonderful exhibit. I encourage you all to go if you haven't already. I have no expertise on the world of art, so what I'd like to simply do is talk about the impact that Shirin's work has had on me personally and talk about the impact it's had in the political context within Iran. The first work I saw from Shirin was in the year 2000. It was the short film she did called Rapture, which was her husband Shoja Azari singing a song from the great Kurdish singer Shahram Nazari, which was based on a poem from the great Persian poet Rumi, Maulana. And for me, this was my first introduction to both Shahram Nazari and to Rumi. And it was really, it's difficult, I think, to if you don't read Persian poetry in its original language, it's difficult to make that mystical connection to it. But this was something that really blew me away. And over the years, I go back to that video every few months just to watch it. And I had the privilege of meeting Shirin not long after that. She had hosted a dinner party in New York for the great Iranian film director Abbas Kiarostami. And it was a group of aspiring Iranian artists and painters. And I always remember that night because Shirin was really, in addition to Kiarostami, the only artist in the room that had really arrived and made it. But she was really the kindest and sweetest person in that room as well. And I think this comes out in her art as well, and I'll come back to that point. So a few months after that, I actually visited Iran for the first time. And I was backpacking throughout the country, and I was charting my itinerary with a cousin of mine. And I said, well, I need to go to the great cities, of course, to Shiraz, to Isfahan, to see Persepolis, to see Mashhad, and to Qazvin. And he said, why Qazvin? Qazvin is only famous for one thing. And those Iranians in the room know it's R-rated. I can't share that. And I said, this is the city of Shirin Neshat. I want to see where Shirin Neshat grew up. And so I visited Qazvin, and I saw the small kucha, the alley where she grew up, which is called Kucha Neshat. And I want to come back to this issue of Shirin's kindness and humility, because it's not just an aside. I think that Iran is a country over the last century which has been plagued by men of certainty, men who have been so certain about their ideologies and their views, and have shown no ability to reflect and perhaps question the fact that their views and ideologies may not be the views and ideologies which everyone in the country shares. And I think the brilliance of Shirin's work is that she's not a man of certainty, she's a woman of uncertainty, and she continues to question Iran's culture, its politics. And a topic I've been thinking about a lot over the last months and years is this question of patriotism and nationalism and the distinction between the two. There's a wonderful definition from Orwell, George Orwell. He says that patriots are those that, it's the love that people feel for their country. And he said that nationalism is that, it's a pride that people feel in their country, but also a belief that one's country is better and more important than other countries. And I think in the Iranian context, we see a lot of symbols and signs of nationalism. You know, the nuclear program, Hezbollah, Iran's influence in Syria and Yemen and Iraq. But these are all signs which make others feel uncomfortable. It's projecting power onto others. And what I love about Shirin's work is really the patriotism. It's a celebration of Iran's culture, its poetry, its literature, but it's not contingent on demeaning or denigrating or threatening any other culture. I love the fact that when I travel throughout the Middle East, at a time of unprecedented acrimony between Arabs and Iranians, Arabs claim her as one of their own as well. They take great pride in her work. And so it's a patriotism which isn't provincial. And the next project she's doing is on the great Egyptian singer Kulthum. So I think that this is something unique in these times and something which I truly admire. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor that's known to many of you, Azar Nafisi, who used to impress upon us the fleetingness, the ephemeralness of politics and the endurance of culture. And she used to always say to us, you know, how many of you can name the Russian czars of the 20th century? And few people in the room could name them. I'm sure Barbara can. She studied Russian at Harvard. But few people in the room could name those Russian czars. But she said, you know, we all know Tolstoy and Chekhov and Dostoevsky. And I think likewise, a century from now, the names of the Iranian politicians of the day, Ahmadinejad, Khamenei, Rafsanjani, will really be forgotten. But I think Shirin Neshad's work and her contributions will truly endure, and her name will stand the test of time. So I will stop there and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you for sticking to 5 minutes, Barbara.
I will do my best as well. First, also let me repeat how honored I am to be included as the token non-Iranian on this panel. But as someone who loves and cares about the country a great deal. I first became aware of the works of Shirin Neshat through her amazing movie, Women Without Men, which I'm sure many of you in your audience have seen. It works, of course, on a number of levels, artistic, historic, political. And even though the movie was made just a few years ago, it reminded me a lot in its style, its sort of fantastical, surrealist style, in places of the works of Ingmar Bergman and Louis Buñuel. And I'd be curious to know if they had an influence on Ms. Neshat, movies like Simon in the Desert and the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie that looked in on particular social groups and showed them in a fantastical sort of way. Women Without Men, as you know, is based in 1953 during the events leading up to and after the coup against Mohammad Mossadegh. And one of the things I most like about the film, and this is a really universal element of it, is the way it, it shows an understanding for revolutionary movements, which have a tendency to fail as soon as they succeed. There's a point during the film after Mossadegh has been overthrown, and there are pro-Shah demonstrators who are pushing out the pro-Mossadegh demonstrators from a central square. And the narrator of the film says, quote, "The sense that everything repeats over time, hope, betrayal, and fear." And of course, we've seen this over and over again in Iran's history and in the history of other revolutions. The film also, of course, is a case study of Iran's patriarchal culture, and the protagonists are four women from very different social milieux who all suffer at the hands of men. And I watched the movie again over the weekend and was struck by the fact that, with one possible exception, all the male characters are unpleasant or disappointing in some profound way. There is the brother of Muniz, who is supposed to be very religious and devout, but he provokes his sister's suicide by trying to keep her a captive in their home and trying to force her into an unwanted marriage. There are the clients of the prostitute Zareen, the men from the coffee house who rape Faizeh, and both the husband and the former boyfriend of the bourgeois housewife Fakhri, who failed to live up to her expectations. And then Muniz, whose dream is to join the pro-Mossadegh anti-Shah movement, is even very disappointed in the end. She runs after a young member of the Tudeh party who proceeds to kill a young soldier in his efforts to escape, so he also disappoints. There's only one man in the entire movie who seems to have real compassion and understanding for women, and that's the caretaker, the gardener, at this country home of Fakhri, this fantastical place where the women go to seek refuge from the cruelty of the men in their lives and the cruelty of the world. I only started going to Iran 20 years ago, so I can't speak with authority about what life was like for women before the revolution. I know that they got the vote only in the early 1960s, but that many members, certainly of the elite and of the middle class, had more freedom than they do today. But to my mind, certainly as someone who goes there, Iranian women in general, and especially women from traditional families, have still managed to progress in many ways since the revolution and since the period that's depicted in Women Without Men. Ayatollah Khomeini, we're so lucky he had daughters. He encouraged women to participate in the revolution. He didn't take away the vote from them, and he let them continue to be educated, and in fact larger numbers in some ways than before. As long as you covered yourself with the proper Islamic dress, you could go to the university, and so now we have women graduates, many more, frankly, in percentage terms than men. Hala, of course, wrote a wonderful book, Reconstructed Lives, about the way in which women became the breadwinners after the revolution, and often the psychological glue that held their families together when the men were purged, lost their businesses, or simply lost all hope. And as you all know, there is a new feminist, not so new feminist movement in Iran, certainly from the mid-90s on, a very strong movement led by women like Shirin Ebadi and Shakla Sherkat, and even the daughter of former President Hashemi Rafsanjani. Every time I return to Iran, I think I'm most struck by the women, by how independent, feisty, and tough they have become. They have changed the nature of Iranian society. They're getting married later, they're having fewer children, they're getting divorced, and they're defying the authorities in all sorts of ways, including totally subverting Islamic dress. Among my acquaintances in Iran are women journalists, business owners, and even a mountain climber. Losing one's virginity, which is a major topic in the movie Women Without Men, is no longer that big an issue in Iran for most young women. And they have learned how to maneuver through the Islamic Republic to build the best lives that they can under the circumstances. I don't see them as victims so much as what one Iranian woman once told me they were. She said, Iranian women are lionesses. If I'm optimistic about the future of Iran, and I try to be, this is the non-Iranian in me, I suppose, that makes me optimistic and not fatalistic. It's because of the women of Iran. And Shireen Nishat is, of course, an outstanding example, but there's so many others. Hala Esfandiari, Azhar Nafisi, Marenges Kar, Nasreen Sotude, Roya Hakakian, Azadeh Moaveni, Roxana Saberi, Tara Barampur, Nazila Fati, I could go on, who have distinguished themselves. And they have many counterparts in Iran whose names are not familiar to even those who specialize in Iran. I think they're going to continue to fight for women's rights, which are human rights, no matter what, no matter who's the president, no matter who's the supreme leader. And that they will not only change Iranian society, but they're going to have a wider impact on women in the region as a whole. And this is obviously a region, as we know, where women have not had enough freedom and have not had enough say on how their societies develop. So this is the message that I take from the work of Shireen Nishat. Thank you.
Roya.
I've known Shireen probably longer than anyone, at least on the panel. And I would be remiss if I didn't let other people who have known her less, albeit from a distance, as a distant friend, that she is personally as beautiful as the work that she portrays. She comes through for friends time and time again and helps young Iranian artists who are starting out. So there is beauty within as much as there's beauty without, and it's been wonderful to have watched you from a distance. I had written some comments about the fact that I think, in fact, the political context is relevant, but in some ways very reductive to the work that Shireen has done. I can't get into the details of that right now, but I can go back to the comment that a woman artist who is graduating from the Yale Master's MFA program, the next generation to Shireen, recently when I asked her, what has been the impact of Shireen on your work, told me, which I think is a wonderful opening for this conversation. I said, you were in Iran, you came 2 years ago, you came to Yale University. This is your first stint with the world outside of Iran. How do you see her work? And she said that Shireen has created a space in which we can not only exist, but can also hope to surpass. And I think that's a beautiful way to begin a conversation, a way of thinking about Shireen's work, a space in which a lot of us can be, but some of us, including those aspiring new artists from Iran, can also surpass. So how do I see that space, and what do I think that space is? All of us who belong to a certain generation, those of us who have either lived through the revolution or have witnessed parts of it and have returned to the revolution, one way or another, consider the revolution the elephant in the middle of our imaginations. No matter what we do, it is the revolution, it is the post-revolutionary Iran that creates a constant engagement for us. And I think Shireen is probably equally engaged as she has had to process looking at Iran in post-revolutionary era. Shireen goes back to Iran, sees the landscape of Iran after the revolution, and it has drastically transformed. At least 50% of the people no longer look as they looked prior to the Iranian Revolution. And some of us, for example, I in my work have been filled with bitterness for that change of landscape. For Shireen, this has not been the case. Shireen has looked at the same landscape, but instead she has created beauty. All of us are trying to reconcile with this transformed landscape, but we cope with the transformed landscape in our own ways. But Shireen has done something extra. She has created a space, as I've said, and I think that is both a space and a bridge. Now, what do I mean? I was thinking very much about the notion of Persian script on the faces of Shireen's portraits. Way back when you started the exhibits, I remember as a young immigrant Iranian going into these photography exhibits and reading, before looking at the photographs, reading what was written on the photographs. Why do we do that? Why do Iranians have a penchant to read first before looking at the photograph? Because we all come from a culture, a tradition that is first and foremost rooted in literature. We read first before we look at things first. We need to connect through the words first before we can connect through video or film or images alone. And so I think the service that Shireen did, the bridge that she made, was to make for a generation of Iranians who could have otherwise been abandoned by the visual arts, creating a melange of two genres of words and images so that we can be hooked by what we know to the images that we know less, that we are less connected to. Now, the same trick, the same artistic Herculean act worked as magnificently, as importantly on Westerners and non-Iranians, but for vastly different reasons. Americans, Western viewers, who can look at the image of a veiled woman and completely dismiss her because she only seems as the photograph reports, now can no longer dismiss her because upon the pages of her face, upon her cheeks, there are scripts that that viewer cannot read or see or decode the image, the meaning of the image. And therefore, one reader, one viewer, the Iranian, gets hooked and feels comfortable through the familiar to then understand the unfamiliar, whereas the Westerner, who is more comfortable with the visual imagery, but can easily dismiss and walk away, is now somewhat intimidated or hooked in a different way by the mysterious codes that are there upon the image. And I think, therefore, probably the Westerner, the non-Iranian reader, needs to pause and think, which is precisely what one could hope from the best of art to do in a viewer, and the effect to create, which is to say you need to pause and think about what the image that you were ordinarily inclined to easily dismiss, to pause and think of it more deeply and try to decode it, try to understand the unfamiliar. For us, the Iranians, it was about getting us to become comfortable through what we knew, which was the written word, to think about ways beyond literature to connect to the world. And I think that is the space that two sets of viewers are now sharing in this common work that I simply adore, beyond the other space that is there for a young generation of women to then think that that some revolutionary work in its own right has been done, and they can not only exist in it, but also surpass it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roya. Okay. Let me ask all three of you a question. Sorry. I come from a different generation than you two. So when I look at Shireen's work, I see the emancipation of Iranian women, then a step back, and then I see them coming out of the shadow, of what they were pushed into. I wonder whether this is your impression too. Karim, you start.
Karim was always emancipated.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. I feel bad about that.
That's all
You
right.
know what? He said that when we arranged the panel, Karim said, maybe I should be the second one because I'm the only man in the.
Last
I said,
speaker,
oh
yeah.
no, we want you will start. Go ahead.
So again, I'm no expert on art, but I think one of the unintended consequences of the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Republic was the education of women. Whereas before the revolution, traditional families were perhaps reluctant to send their daughters to mixed schools. Post-revolution, in a gender-segregated educational system, women have really flourished in a way that has certainly exceeded the male population of Iran, to the point that I think 60% of university students are women. And I think Shirin captures that in her work, especially the Women of Allah series, that, you know, on one hand, the women are covered and the photos are black and white compared to the very colorful pre-revolutionary days. But then you see them holding rifles and guns and you know, they're kind of projecting power at the same time. So in a way it captures the dichotomy which has happened post-revolution.
I don't see it that way. I don't think that the Iranian regime has done something particularly great by sending a lot of women to schools, colleges and universities, because I think we all forget that a lot of those women who attend those schools and universities can't do anything with their degrees. They are unemployed, and their degrees compared to their equivalents in the world abroad are often meaningless. What I do very much like about what Shirin has done has only to do with what we as post-revolutionary generation have tried to make sense of this terrible phenomenon, which is I've never gone back to Iran since I left, which is 1984. And there are times that I've walked in places where there are a lot of, where the Iranian regime has had major influence, including Damascus in 2002, which a lot of Iranian tourists and a lot of representatives of the Iranian government existed. And I gasped. So I think there's something to be said about how do we digest this indigestible phenomenon? How do we understand this cataclysm? And I think for me, it has been grief, bitterness, and what do we do now? For Shirin, it has been, according to my understanding, and I hope to be corrected at some point, it's been a reconciliation with a strange sense of beauty and power, both of which exist, but they're not the end of the story.
Barbara?
Yeah, if I could just add, I'm kind of in between, I guess. You know, as somebody who goes to Iran every couple of years and has seen how dramatically it has changed. You know, yes, there was Ahmadinejad, who was an idiot and ruined the society in so many ways, but the women kept marching on. And I would disagree with Roya that these are meaningless degrees, even if obviously there are not enough jobs for these women. I always remember my son was a physics major in college, and he was doing some research for a professor one summer, and he was going through all the published papers and, you know, to find some research that was relevant to what he was doing, and he found a paper from a young woman from Sharif University that was just what he needed, and he was very surprised that it was a woman and from Iran. And this is not an isolated example. There's going to be a conference in Berlin in a couple of weeks of startup entrepreneurs from Iran. Many of them are women. They do extremely well in STEM. So, you know, there are things that regimes can control and facilitate or impede, and there are things that they simply can't. And one thing they cannot control, I think, is the mentality of the young people in general, but particularly of the women. So again, I don't want to be too optimistic because there are many impediments, but I think that if you were able to go back to the Iran of today, you would not be as horrified as you were when you left in the 80s.
Look,
I won't answer, don't worry.
Roya, do you see the reflection of this change in the work of Shirin? I mean, when you walk through her exhibit, I'm not going to give you my but I want.
I saw it, 25 years ago when she first started with the photographs, and I think.
But do you see the the reflection of this change in
Uh,
her recent work
Of
of this sense of women who were emancipated when then and then are coming out. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm focusing on women because the topic of this panel is gender and politics. So I'm trying to keep it relatively narrow, the focus to the topic. But Shirin is speaking
I don't
tonight, and then she will broadly explain her work.
I think the influence which I think is incredibly important is a cultural distancing inside Iran from literature in general. I think the bungling of the revolutionary project in 1979 was in a way brought about a disappointment in literature in general, because a lot of the advocates of the revolution were great poets of Iran, great novelists of Iran, who got it wrong, you know. And I think there was a distancing from literature in general, and people began to look to the visual arts for it as a sense of hope. And I think in that, Shirin came exactly at the right time. She walked viewers, especially the Iranian viewers, by planting the written word, because that was the familiar, and we could connect to the work through that, but then taking us to the visual, which is something that was more foreign to the Iranian viewer. And I think to reduce her effect, or to simply, I understand that this is a topic of our panel, but to simply talking about the images and gender would be somewhat limiting. I think she has inspired a whole generation. A lot of them are women. I see them coming through various universities, especially Yale, which is where I am. And I think that is the impact, the possibility that has opened up in a whole genre of art, which was a lot less populated before this.
Karim, you want to add
Well,
something?
I'll make a broader point, which is I certainly wasn't trying to endorse the policies of the Islamic Republic. My point was that it was in spite of the Islamic Republic that these women have emerged. But a broader point I'd make is that, especially for those of us on the outside, we like work which glorifies the greatness of Persia, of pre-Islamic Iran, and all the nice things about Iranian culture. But the reality of modern Iran is that it's not just the Islamic Republic, as we know, but it's not just Persia either. And I think that's what's wonderful about Shirin's work. I mean, the first project was Women of Allah, which captured life in the Islamic Republic for women in the late 90s. And then we saw more recently in 2009, amidst the popular uprisings, the Shahnameh project. And when I think about kind of the images that capture Iran, certainly the iconic images of the revolution were middle-aged, bearded, turbaned men. And I think what was striking in 2009 was the iconic image was a young, modern, educated woman, Neda Agha Sultan. And the reality still, as I said, is that those two Irans coexist within one. I prefer one. I think many of us on the panel prefer one more than the other. But this is patriotism, as I said. It's not just privileging one side versus another. It's a affection for one's country, and accepting kind of the realities of that country, not trying to hide it.
You know, the Women of Allah created in me a sense of anger of what had happened to women. While when I watched the Shahnameh one, it was pain. And I felt there is a difference between the anger and the pain. And I wonder whether this was the sense you two had also by watching this.
I haven't seen the exhibit.
Shahnameh,
I'm
okay.
going tonight.
Okay. So
But I did say that there's I am filled with bitterness, but not over the experience in general, rather than and I mean and that's what I think I channel in my writing. But I think we all try to reconcile and understand what has happened, and creating beauty out of what to me is ugly is one way of dealing with it, I think.
Barbara, okay, we have a few minutes, so I'll open the floor to your questions. Please be very brief. Questions? We'll continue. Where was there in the back?
Yeah.
Yes, please. Just wait for the mic, please, and identify yourself and speak loud.
Hi, I'm Kerr Houston, a Baltimore-based art historian. I just wonder if any of you had any thoughts on authorship in Shirin's work. She often works collaboratively. She has photographers take some of her images. In that sense, her work frustrates traditional notions of power as it's connected to authorship or proprietariness. Just wonder if you had any responses to that.
Interesting
Go on.
question.
Okay.
I mean, in the sense that she collaborates with so many talented people. I don't know that that's unique to her, but
Roya, Karim?
What I'd say, I've been following the art scene in the Middle East. I think the Dubai has really been an engine for the art scene in the Middle East. And what I've found remarkable over the last decade is how many younger generation artists have sought to emulate the work of Shirin. So we understand it's a collaborative process, but the kind of her conceptual vision was really unprecedented, as I understand, and she's inspired so many folks from the younger generation, and as I said, not just Iranians, from Morocco to Pakistan. In that sense, I think it's what Steve Jobs once said about the Beatles. He said, the brilliance was in their collaboration. If it was just kind of one artist on their own, probably wouldn't have done a whole lot. But I think there is that unique brilliance in collaboration.
I had the same experience once. I was talking to someone about Shirin's work, and I said the Iranian artist, Shirin. And this person turned around and told me, she is not Iranian. She belongs to the Middle East, and she belongs to the wider world. So, and that was before Kulthum even, so there is that sense that Shirin has created something universal.
It also should be pointed out that being able to collaborate is a very unique quality in Iranians. I mean, there's the reason why the country is in the shape that it's in. Collaboration is not a strong point.
Yes, please. Mr. Kosar, just wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. Nika Kosar, cartoonist. Of course, I think this question should be also answered by Ms. Neshat herself, but we are in
she
the
won't
post...
answer questions.
I know, but...
Tonight, if you want to go to the Hershon, she will answer
Thank
the
you.
question.
In the post Charlie Hebdo era that we are in right now, some of the symbols that Shirin has used in her work would possibly provoke some who are very sensitive right now in the Middle East and the MENA region. How do you think her work or work similar to hers could actually grow in that region with such sensitivities? Thank you.
Who wants to take?
I think Shirin has always said that she, albeit secular in heart, she's a Muslim, and that is a very important part of her background and upbringing. And I think that fundamental relationship makes, I hope, whoever is out there looking for an excuse to take a second guess. And I think it is that relationship that makes this entirely different from the works that, for instance, that have previously caused problems for Charlie Hebdo or Salman Rushdie. Her fundamental relationship to the work is that of someone who believes Islam has been an important part of her upbringing and fundamental tradition, if I'm correct. Yeah.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I wouldn't compare it to Charlie Hebdo. I mean, as far as I know, there's no defamation of the Prophet Muhammad or, I mean, some of the images are disturbing, but they're disturbing in the way that good art should be disturbing, because it's the contradictory juxtaposition that makes you think about the image in a way. But I don't see it as disrespectful. I don't see it as necessarily anti-religious.
I mean, here I want to be pessimistic about not certainly Shirin's work, but about the future of the Middle East, because I see it as that it's a region which is was once a very cosmopolitan region, and you see, starting with a variety of events, which was in the 1950s, Iranian Revolution, but the death of cosmopolitanism in the region, in this growing homogenization and intolerance, where Iran is Shiite, Persians, Arab world, Sunni, Muslims, and an intolerance towards whether it's cartoons which ridicule religion or respect for the rights of others. And I think what's happening is that these works which do challenge cultural and political norms, increasingly, like yourself, you're the best example of that, are in exile. They're not being created within those countries themselves. And I, unfortunately, with perhaps the exception of Iran, see this as a continuing trend in the Middle East.
One last question, and I'm going to read the question from the overflow. I want very quick answers from you. What is the connection between art and politics in Iran today, and how are women affecting this? 30 seconds each. Roya, start 30 seconds, and then we'll call on Shirin.
I think politics and art in Iran. I think in literature that means something entirely different than it does in the visual arts. I think in literature Persian literature, in my view, is in somewhat of a state of crisis, looking for a new identity that is not so rooted in politics. However, I think the visual arts have been able to emancipate itself and music from that. Although in music we now see the blossoming of a cast of singers and groups who are being incredibly political, but also very trendy and likable at the same time.
There's a very close connection, obviously. Any of you who have seen modern Iranian cinema know how fabulous this work is and how political it is in many ways, because it's able to depict the reality of Iranian life despite the restrictions in a way that I don't think any other medium has been able to do. I see it in design, I see it in modern art, in the modern calligraphy in particular. I see it in fashion design. I mean, there is so much creativity in Iran that is finding a way to express itself despite the restrictions.
Okay.
I'd say that politics in Iran is very polarizing. It separates Iranians from one another, and it's polarized Iran from the outside world. And I think people are tired of politics in Iran. They're really tired of politics. And art, I think, has been, whether it's cinema or painting, or certainly Shirin's work, has been a unifying factor, whether you consider yourself a leftist or a rightist or a nationalist or a monarchist. I think you can all appreciate the work of Shirin Nishat, or you appreciate the movie Separation. So I think increasingly, and especially amongst the younger generation, whereas in the late 70s, people's extracurricular activities were having an ideology, political ideology. Increasingly, people are channeling their efforts and their interests into art.
Thank you. Shirin, you can have the last word, please.
Well, first of all, I have to say it was incredibly flattering to hear so many smart people talk about my work, and I feel like artists should just make art and not speak. I think Picasso once said, art is a lie that helps us realize the truth. And I think that pretty much defines my approach to making up art. Again, I have to remind everyone over and over again that my work is a work of fiction, or at least my language is where fiction and reality are blurred. And that truly, I think fiction, it's at the place of imagination of the artist. And my part is not my own personal anxiety, dreams, fears. And yet, on my rational mind, I am deeply Iranian. I deeply care about the world. I'm deeply caring about issues that are above and beyond myself. So my work is an expression of this dichotomy, this personal yet social desire, this idea of fiction versus reality. Now, when it comes to this idea of interpreting history, then does this an approach of an artist that is relying so much on fiction, a superficial interpretation, or could it be profound? And on my part, I feel like I take great responsibility on the conscious level when my work is addressing sociopolitical, religious issues that is really founded by information that is truthful. Yet I allow myself in indulging in my imagination, because I think ultimately what remains, truly what remains of me, of my work, ultimately, hopefully, it will transcend beyond Iran and Iranian culture. I think when you think about Goya, you think about Picasso, people who have done work at times that has approached political crisis, that they have gone down the history not to be only about the countries that the artists are born. So my dream is that my interpretation of Iranian history is simply about a testimony of the Iranian struggle and Iranian facing tyranny. And part of that, my own life has been invested in. So it's really all about that. And so by no means I'm an expert, by no means I have the answers. I only am very good at raising questions. So if anyone looks at my work for any particular real, truthful interpretation, is looking at the wrong place. And I gave a great importance to fiction. So I hope when you walk in the exhibition, you pay equal attention to the fiction as much as the historical. Thank you so much.
Special thanks to our panelists who stuck to the time, to their 5 minutes, and gave us very short answers. Thank you all for coming. We are serving lunch on the 5th floor. Please make your way to the 5th floor and help yourself to a light lunch. And thank you for Shirin, Melissa Go, the curator. And I would invite you to go definitely tonight to hear Shirin, to look at the exhibit. It's really a treat to go to the her show. Thank you for your call.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.